Let's talk about, though, this death cults phrase, which I think has gotten so much attention, and sort of define how you see this struggle, not only between good and evil, but people who love life and people who love death.
Yeah, it was something that came to me because for most of my adult life, I've thought about this great challenge that the extremists, so certainly the jihadists say, which is we love death more than you love life. I remember we all heard it from Al-Qaeda before and after 9/11. We heard it from ISIS in the 2010s. We've heard it for decades from Hamas, Hezbollah, and many others. We hear it from members of the revolutionary government in Tehran. I thought about that a lot, but I'd also underestimated it. And when October the 7th happened, several things happened immediately afterwards that deeply shook me. One was that on the 8th of October in New York City, I went down to Times Square because there was a protest arranged. And the protest was of New Yorkers celebrating the attacks that were still going on. And I was horrified by that. And it was one of the reasons I tried to get to Israel as soon as I could afterwards, because I thought, well, we're going to see some kind of fork in the road here. If there are people, willing to stand in Times Square and celebrate a massacre as it's still going on, this is a moment when you should come to a time of test as a society, and we'll find that there are people who fail it. The failing turned out to be much wider and deeper than I expected. But the second thing is that in the immediate aftermath of the atrocities, as well as going to the sites of the massacres and speaking to the survivors and hostage families and going around the hospitals and the morgues and much more and finding out what was going on, I saw a lot of the footage that was taken on the day, and it was shown to certain journalists and others. It was definitely not for wider publication. But there was a call that was there, which some of you may have heard because it has been released more widely. And it was a call that one of the October the 7th Hamas terrorists made back to his parents in Gaza. Probably some of you will have heard it. For those who haven't, he's in a home of Israelis in the south of Gaza, and he gets on his mobile phone. Again, this is a sort of fascinating and terrible thing about this in this age where you can have a medieval ideology. I'd call it medieval, but that's to insult the medieval ages. It's a medievalist style ideology with smartphones. And this guy phones back to his parents and he says, he gets hold of his father and he says, Father, I have killed 10 Jews with my own hands. With my own hands, your son has killed 10 Jews. And he is ecstatic. Ecstatic. He says, get mother on the phone. Get mother. Get my brother on the phone. Turn on to WhatsApp video. I can show you the bodies. With my own hands, your son is killed. There was something that was rife across the accounts I got from survivors and others of that morning. People like the young people who were dancing at the Nova party in the early hours when Hamas came in. They all had the same thing that they said, which was that the terrorists were elated. Not just barbaric, but elated in their barbarism. And I thought about that a lot. And of course, the statements which Hamas and their backers made for years, they said exactly this. They said how much they loved death, how much they worshipped death. Yahya Sinwar, who and the main planner of the 7th of October, he said, he was in an Israeli prison, some of you will know. I describe his story in the book. He was in an Israeli prison in the 2000s for throttling 4 Palestinians with his own hands. And when he was in prison, an Israeli doctor who was there spotted that Sinwar was falling over after morning prayers in the prison. And he says there's something wrong. And he sends him to a specialist unit that discovers that Yahya Sinwar had a tumor on his brain. He would have died within weeks. And these Israeli doctors saved his life. They operated on him, gave him world-class care, He went back to prison. And he actually talked quite a lot with the doctor who spotted that he was ill. And the nephew of that doctor was one of the people massacred on the morning of the 7th of October by Sinwar's forces. But Sinwar himself was released in a prisoner exchange after the kidnapped Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit was swapped out for Palestinian prisoners in Israel. And when he was back in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar said in one public speech, he said, we will go into the Zionist entity and we will rip the hearts out of the Jews. Mm. Now, we live in a society, thank God, in which all of this sounds impossible, because our societies in the West are predicated in a way on a presumption. And the presumption is what we want from our lives and with our lives is what everyone wants. You hear this all the time. It's a sort of banal observation that anyone can make. Well, doesn't everyone want the same thing? And to an extent, that can be true. People want to make a living, they want to have a family, or whatever. Yes. But there are also people in the world who want something utterly different, who really do worship death, who really do regard the highest point of life as being to take life. I give an example in the book which was much on my mind, which was Ismail Haniyeh, one of the leaders of Hamas, was in our great ally Qatar throughout the period after the 7th and indeed before. And on camera, some of you may have seen it, he had 4 sons who were all also Hamas leaders in Gaza. And at one point in the war, an Israeli airstrike hit the car which his sons were in, and they were killed on operations. And there is video of Ismail Haniyeh in Qatar being given the news that his sons have been killed. And he's happy. Because for him, they've been martyred. Now, I compare this to the fact that, and I don't mention the name, but I was in Jerusalem around this time, and I was going in early in the war, and I went in to see a member of the government in Israel, in Jerusalem. And I went into the office, this person, and he had his head in his hands because he had just got some terrible news. And the news was that Gadi Eisenkot, who was at that point one of the members of the war cabinet in Israel, the news had just come in that Gadi Eisenkot's son had been killed that morning in Gaza. And the next day, actually, as it happened, Gadi Eisenkot's nephew also fell in battle. And I just remember this member of the Israeli government saying, I've got to call Gadi. I don't know what to say.
And he had been to his bar mitzvah, right?
He said, I was at that boy's bar mitzvah. Yeah. And I just remember the overwhelming grief and the proximity of this war. I mean, this isn't somewhere, you send other people's children. These are your children in Israel. And I just thought, what a difference it is, again, and I can give thousands of examples of this, but what a difference in a society where you find out your children are dead and you're happy, and a society where you would do anything but get that news. This, as I say, it's a dichotomy that is everything, but yet most of the Western mind would find almost impossible to comprehend. Like, why would somebody want to go and take life? And I'm afraid the answer is a very, very deep death cult ideology, which is incredibly destructive to the Muslim world and destructive to everyone else as well, but which has to be countered. Because it's not like you can make any compromise with this.
Right. Critics of the Israeli government will say that there's a lot of innocent people in Gaza who don't worship Geth, who have been killed in airstrikes and the rest of it. How do you sort of square that? Do you think that Israel has gone too far at times and needs to be walked back?
Well, if I may say so, most of the criticism in the Western media and from, let's say, many politicians is there's been too many innocent deaths in Gaza and it's got to stop. Okay. That's broadly speaking the view. I always have a challenge to these people, which I simply say to them, Fine. Tell me how you would achieve the following. Let's say we're in New York. Let's say that New Jersey fires rockets for years. Let's say that for 18 years, the government there has used all money coming in to enrich themselves and to build a vast tunnel network in which they can store munitions and hostages and much more. And let's say that right next door to where you're living, this very densely well-built up terrorist infrastructure invaded you, killed hundreds and hundreds of your people, took 250 more hostage. Tell me how you would operate in that terrain to ensure that you kill or capture all the leaders of the people who did this and wipe out their ability to ever rule that entity again. And secondly, how you get back 250 hostages. And I have yet to hear a critic of the Israeli government's actions give me a viable plan for how you would get back the hostages. And there are still several dozen hostages in captivity, some living, and how you would punish and kill the people who did that. Because just again, if you extrapolate out the population of Israel, about 9 million, to a population the size of the United States, this was equivalent on October the 7th to some 44,000 Americans being killed in one day and another 10,000 Americans being taken hostage. And nobody from left or right, Democrat, Republican, or anyone else has been able to persuade me that if that happened in this country, we would not tear up the earth to get those hostages back.
Yeah. But is the... But do you think the objective of defeating Hamas, is that possible? Is that possible as a goal?
Well, it's very interesting. Again, there's a type of criticism of the actions of the Israeli government and armies since the 7th of October, which, by the way, I should have said, in terms of fighting a war in a heavily built-up civilian area, the best analyses that we can get, because it's not easy, because everything, as you probably know, all of the death toll figures are the Gaza Health Ministry, which is Hamas. And I mean, the idea that Hamas has a health ministry is itself. But also all the figures come from that. But let's just concede, yes, a lot of people have been killed. But the best analyses of somebody like Spencer at West Point, John Spencer, is that it's probably a ratio of something like 1 terrorist to 1 civilian. Now, losing 1 civilian for 1 terrorist is terrible, but it is infinitely better than any operation the British Army, the American Armed Forces, or others have been. Most of the operating procedure of other Western armies is roughly 3 to 4 civilians for every 1 target. It's high, but the Israelis have massively outperformed our own past experience in Iraq, in Fallujah and elsewhere, in slightly similar terrain. So just on that, it's very important to keep that in mind. As for the ideology, I have yet to be persuaded that there is something so extraordinary about Hamas as a force that their ideology can never be wiped out. We have seen many death cult ideologies in history.
The ones you mentioned.
The ones I mentioned.
Century.
Or let's just take one that, let's take Imperial Japan. The citizens of this country and states like this were told by many people in the 1940s there was nothing you could do. You could fight them. There was no way you would ever eradicate the ideology of the worship of the emperor and so on. And just consider what we knew about Japan as this country was fighting. I mean, we knew that this was an army that eventually had pilots who were willing to die whilst flying their planes into an American ship. Consider the fact that in places like Iwo Jima, American soldiers, young men, were fighting people who were fanatics very similar, different ideology, but a very similar type of fanaticism. If you'd have said then, in 2025, Japan will be more than within the community of nations. Indeed, will have been for decades. Will be a great success as a society.
Business leader.
Business leaders in everything. But you would have been able to find people, and you could find people, right up until the surrender, that again, in Japan was inconceivable before the emperor was forced by this country and its military to cease. You would have found people who say there's nothing we can do to wipe that out. I do not believe there is something so unique about Hamas that among all the death cults we've seen throughout history, this one is uniquely virile. And I would just add that, look at the success of the IDF since October the 7th against all of these people, the individuals, the groups. It turns out that all the people that on American college campuses and on British college campuses they mourned so much or they admired so much, they're all gone. And I've got news for those students, by the way, in America and Britain and elsewhere who've spent the last 18 or so months dressing up in Palestinian terrorist chic and
Queers for Palestine.
Queers for Palestine and so on. I mean, these at some point, I hope these young people grow up, but they've got a heck of a shock because everybody that they have claimed to admire, apart from being rapists and murderers and sadists, are also now dead.
Is that
so? They can continue to parade with admiration for Sinwar and Nasrallah and all the rest, but they're all encountering their 72 virgins.